Thank you. Human beings have always searched for certainty. Some have found it in philosophy. The pre-Socratic, like Anaximander, found it in nous. Plato found it in a world of eternal forms. Descartes found it in the cogito, I think, therefore I am. Spinoza said that all substance and its modifications, that accounts for all of reality. Some have found it in the state. Some have found it in ethnic groups. And many have found it in religion, a certainty in God and in human beings' relationship with God. St. Augustine said, "Our souls are restless, Lord, until they rest in Thee." What I want to explore this afternoon is the relationship between religion and liberal democracy, which I think is an important topic for a couple of reasons. One, the United States claims to be a liberal democracy. And religion certainly plays an important political role in the United States today, as I'll explore. The argument that I want to make today is that religion and liberal democracy are not compatible. Now, my focus is going to be, for purposes of this presentation, Christianity, although much of what I will be saying applies to Islam and even to Judaism. And I'm going to focus on the United States. I'm going to be talking about, first of all, what do I mean by religion and what do I mean by liberal democracy. And then I want to focus on the importance of religion in U.S. politics. And then finally, I want to look at the incompatibility of religion and liberal democracy on a number of fronts. The nature of social truth, epistemology, the view of human nature, values, the ends of the state, decision-making process, and in terms of freedom. Since colonial times, religion and politics have intermingled in the United States. Several American colonies were founded, at least in part, to guarantee religious freedom. The secular nature of American government and separation of church and state were important topics during the debate on the United States Constitution. Writing in 1835, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America, "The religious atmosphere of the country," he said, "was the first thing that struck me on arrival in the United States." More recently, during President Obama's first campaign, his religious affiliation was an important issue in that debate and in that campaign. By all the normal yardsticks of religious commitment, the strength of religious institutions, practices, and beliefs, the United States has resisted the pressure towards secularity. Institutionally, churches are probably the most vital volunteer organization in a country that puts a premium on joining up. And Americans overwhelmingly, 70%, consider the United States as a Christian nation. There's also a strong correlation between religiosity and partisan political affiliation, with the Republican Party being more religious than the Democratic Party. But I'll get into this in greater detail in a few moments. I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to define two important terms. First, religion. The word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to tie up, to restrain, to bind. And it also perhaps comes from religio, meaning respect or fear of what is sacred. What I mean by formal religion, variously described as official, institutionalized, or organized, formal religion comprises official religious doctrines that are determined by specialized religious organizations and implemented by trained religious professionals. The doctrines are conveyed to believers through symbols, liturgy, and other rituals. Now, I'm not speaking, when I speak about religion, about personal moral codes, personal ethical codes, or spirituality. I'm talking about the formal, institutionalized religion and its effect on politics. The next term I'd like to define, now that I've defined religion, is the term liberal democracy. In a liberal democracy, emphasis is placed on the individual, freedom of thought and expression, toleration of differing political views and opinions based on the contingency of political truth. That, in other words, there is not an absolute fixed political truth. Public deliberation on matters of national policy. Majority rule while respecting minority rights. And pluralism, whereby public policy is the product of group conflict, and that the public interest tends to emerge out of the welter of competing individual and group claims. The assumption that underlies what I've just said, these characteristics of liberal democracy, is that there is no fixed political truth to be discovered or discerned. As Aristotle said, political truth exists in the realm of the probable and the contingent, and is the product of discourse and debate. All right, I've defined my terms. Now I want to briefly summarize the effect of religion, the influence of religion on politics in the United States today. They are salient factors in determining public policy and public preferences. Religious beliefs then do have political impact. 1/3 of Americans subscribe to a literal interpretation of the Bible. And so religion is fundamental in U.S. politics. In general, the less educated a person is, the more likely he or she is to subscribe to a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. According to the Pew Forum, Religion and Public Life, 5% of Americans with no education beyond high school subscribe to a literal interpretation of the Bible. As education increases, fundamentalism decreases. What becomes important is that in general, the more religious a person is, the more intolerant that person is likely to be of divergent political views. A well-established finding from decades of social science research is that those professing religious affiliation and beliefs tend to be more politically intolerant. That is, specifically, be less willing to extend political rights to those whom they view as political foes. And this is particularly true of religious traditionalists, who make up about 31% of Americans. Traditionalists regularly attend church services, believe in God and the devil, and see moving away from God as causing most of the world's social problems. Religious traditionalism seems to be associated with a generalized propensity toward intolerance, not just intolerance of anti-religion. Religious traditionalism makes an independent contribution to political intolerance. Data indicate that dogmatism certainly underlies intolerance and religious traditionalism. But even holding dogmatism and other variables constant, those holding traditional religious beliefs are more likely to be politically intolerant. A particular manifestation of religion and politics in the United States is the Tea Party. 41% of the electorate in the past national election were Tea Party supporters. And Tea Party members are much more likely than registered voters as a whole to say that their religion is the most important factor in determining their opinion on social issues. People who adopt that fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, whether they're in the Tea Party or not, and this is a critical factor, believe that religious rules, precepts, and values should be reflected in public policy. 32% of Americans believe that the Bible should be the basis of law in this country, and that the legal system of this country should reflect biblical teachings, biblical provisions, virtually no different than what you see in a number of Arab countries, although one part of that survey said when they were asked about that, they said, well, no, it's not the same thing because our religion is the true religion. I'm not so sure that that would play in the Arab countries. 6 in 10 white evangelical Protestants say then that the Bible should be the guiding principle in making laws, even if it conflicts with the will of the people. And people also, the people who attend religious services frequently are more inclined to consider the Bible as the ultimate source of legal authority, with 52% of those who attend church at least once a week saying the Bible should be the primary source of law in this country. 2/3 who subscribe to a literal interpretation of Scripture believe that the Bible should have more influence over American law than the legislature, the courts, or the people. I could go on and give additional documentation. It's obvious that religion plays an important role in American politics, but it's also obvious that it tends to be more of a fundamentalist, traditionalist view of religion. It's not the Unitarians who are dominating American politics. And this has some important implications for whether or not liberal democracy is possible. The assumption being that the United States at least aspires to be a liberal democracy. So I want to look at the heart of my presentation, whether or not religion and liberal democracy are philosophically compatible. First, I want to compare and contrast the view of truth that religion holds versus the liberal democratic view of political truth. As I said earlier, the religious view of truth is absolute. It is unchanging. Absolute and unchanging. While manifestations of the truth may change, the underlying truth does not. Pope Pius IX, in publishing the Syllabus of Errors, made the statement, error has no rights, and then went on to list all of the errors of the modern age, which were absolutely, without a doubt, evil. There was no question about it. So acceptance or intuition becomes the way of gaining religious truth. Religious truth is discerned rather than produced through public debate and discussion. Often religious truth is imparted to people by an authoritarian source and is accepted on the basis of that person's authority, that is clothed in some kind of mystical sanction without any understanding on the part of the believer. It is the source of the truth that makes the truth the truth. And this is particularly true in terms of revealed truth, of which the believer has no direct apperception. The ordinary person is not capable of apprehending religious truth. An interesting example of this occurred back in the 19th century in Spain when the Bishop of Toledo contacted the rector of the university in Toledo, the Catholic University, because he was concerned, the bishop was concerned that personalism was creeping into the curriculum of the Catholic University. Personalism was things like human dignity and those kinds of things. And the rector of the university wrote back to the bishop that he had nothing to worry about because, as the rector said, far be it from us the dangerous novelty of thinking. That's the religious view of what constitutes truth. Now, the liberal democratic view of truth is that truth, particularly political truth, exists in the realm of the probable and the contingent. It is not a certain fixed truth. And so what constitutes good public policy exists, as Aristotle said, in the realm of the probable and the contingent. One cannot expect the same degree of certainty in politics that one does in math or science. To search for such certainty is misplaced. Democratic political truth, then, is not a priori truth, and the source of an opinion or inference does not automatically, for the liberal Democrat, validate the opinion or the inference. There's an interesting example of this, too. I didn't do it in the paper in Oxford because I read it when I came home, but recently there was a dispute at Butte Central about the firing of this teacher who became pregnant and she wasn't married. And one of the local ministers that was in, I brought the letter to the editor, responded to someone who had defended her rights and had in the Diocese of Helena. And the person who had done this had said, well, you know, this is a matter of dispute. We need to talk about it. We need to consider it. And the pastor of the local church wrote in a letter to the editor, no, it is absolute truth. The Bible is absolute. There is no question. She broke the command of the Bible, therefore she was guilty. No debate, no discussion. It's very similar to the old Catholic notion that once Rome had spoken, the matter is settled. Somewhat at variance with the liberal democratic view of truth. The next dimension that I'd like to look at is in terms of epistemology. The religious way of apprehending truth differs from the democratic political way of apprehending truth. The religious approach to discovering truth is inimical to the democratic method of discovering truth. From the religious perspective, if a person does not know the truth, it may be because of ignorance, or it may be because of a perverse will. If it's because of ignorance, you instruct the person. But if the person does not see the error of her ways or the error of his ways, then you can use force. At the turn of the last century, a missionary, in defending American imperialism because it was advancing Christianity, said we must thrash the natives until they understand who we are. And they must see that every shot fired and every cannon discharged is done in the name of righteousness. And a few years ago during the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, one of the local priests in his sermon said, this is great because it will give us the opportunity of converting the heathen to Christianity. Again, that is a fundamental, non-disputable truth at the basis. If you don't know it because of ignorance, we'll instruct you, but if you continue to be perverse, we'll use other means. And so if a person continues having a problem because of a perverse will, even after instruction, you forcibly convert or punish them. Error has no rights, is the fundamental informing principle. In mathematics, A wrong answer has no intrinsic value in and of itself. It is wrong. And what would you do if a math student consistently clung to a wrong answer? We would probably conclude, even after instruction, that if that person continued to do that, there was a perverse will operating. That view is the religious view of truth, that it is absolute, and if you don't perceive it, it could be because of ignorance, so we'll convert you, we'll instruct you, but if not, it could be because of an ill will. In terms of political decision-making, religion seeks to impose certainty and exactness where it does not belong. Because the religious view of truth is that it is discovered or discerned. Dogmatism, such as religious dogmatism, makes all deliberative questions into judicial questions. And this absolutism holds sway in terms of the Christian right. A majority of Christian right group members enter into any negotiations and deliberations convinced that there is a single correct point of view on most policy matters. The liberal democratic view is somewhat different than this. Truth is created through the process of public deliberation. The source of truth is the individual. Discussion and debate produce truth. And deliberation assumes contingency. Because as Aristotle said about things that are as they are, anyone who believes such doesn't waste time in deliberation. Probably in most math classes, the answer to a math question is not the result of a popular vote of the students. Deliberation assumes contingency. And for the liberal Democrat, it is this deliberative process that produces truth. Truth has to be publicly verified. We even choose the standards for right conduct. Minority rights rest on tolerance of diversity and diverging views. But if truth is absolute, then why grant those who do not agree any rights at all? Error has no rights. Political deliberation, on the other hand, assumes contingency, absoluteness. Another dimension on which they differ is in terms of underlying values. Obedience is a prime religious value. Following the tenets and adhering to the precepts of one's particular religion is a prime religious value. In addition to obedience, religion tends to emphasize biblical authority, belief in God, and conformity to God's will as interpreted by a particular church. In contrast, liberal democratic politics emphasizes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the fundamental goodness of human nature, tolerance, personal freedom, the value of diversity and diverse opinion, the right to privacy, freedom of thought and conscience, freedom of inquiry is a big one, and the right to speak what your mind discovers is another fundamental value. Freedom of speech and expression, the value of public deliberation is the best way of determining public policy, the rationality of people, and popular sovereignty. Again, a difference. Religion and liberal democratic politics also differ in terms of the ends they pursue. The end of religion is salvation in an afterlife, but in order to achieve this salvation, one must submit to the commandments and demands of the particular religion. The Christian religion holds the key to eternal life. By contrast, the end of liberal democratic politics is the expedient in the sense of producing and providing safety, security, order, justice, and the greatest good for the greatest number in this life. Religion and liberal democratic politics also diverge in terms of their view of human nature. The religious view of human nature has been that government is a punishment for sin. Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. And if people were basically good, if they had not fallen through original sin and so forth, we would not need government. Only obedience to rightful higher authority can rescue human beings from their flawed character. In contrast, the liberal democratic view has a much more elevated view of human nature, that human beings are capable of reason and capable of making quality decisions. In and of itself, the human person for the liberal Democrat is worthy of respect, and the worth of a human being does not depend on redemption by God. Therefore, people can rule themselves. Religion and democratic politics also differ in terms of how they view the decision-making process. The religious view of deliberation and public decision-making is akin to democratic centralism. There can be some allowance for debate and discussion until a decision has been made by those in authority. Then dissent ceases. By contrast, the liberal democratic approach to decision-making is that the best decisions regarding what constitutes good public policy result from public deliberation and debate. And since there are no fixed political truths to be discovered, the best public policy comes as the result of unfettered conflict between ideas, with the majority determining what is best. Religion and liberal democratic politics also differ, and I won't go into these because I'm running out of time, but in terms of underlying values, the definition of freedom, and what constitutes legitimate authority. Religion, for example, does not place a great deal of importance on popular consent. As one theologian said, the kingdom of God is not a democracy. Certainly the liberal democratic view does present that different view that democracy is important and that this state should be run democratically, and that popular sovereignty and popular choice is the basis of political decision-making. So I'll conclude very quickly with two quotations that kind of sum up what I'm talking about, because my argument is that when religion and politics mix, neither is well said. That organized religion is incompatible with liberal democracy. And I remember when I was preparing this talk, I saw one little statement on a bumper sticker. The last time we mixed religion and politics, people got burned at the stake. Two quotations that I want to end with are one from the French existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. She said, "I tore myself away from the safe comfort of certainties through my love for truth, and truth rewarded me." And Marcus Aurelius, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." Thank you.
My topic is feminism and religion, are they compatible? And I want to begin with the true story of a little girl named Ella Hastings. She was born in Southern Ireland in the 1880s, living in a poor family, common, too many children for the parents to support. She was lucky in one respect, and that is she had an older brother who adored her and who saw himself as her protector and who would eventually save her life. When Ella was about 6 years of age, a priest came to the house and took her to an orphanage. For the next 10 years, she would be virtually a prisoner of the Catholic Church. She would be denied all human rights, the right to respect herself, the right to contact anyone in the outside world, every right imaginable. She would be daily subjected to what we can only call emotional abuse, told how sinful and evil she was, primarily because she was female, and occasionally to brutal physical abuse. As she grew older, became an adolescent, the priest noticed how beautiful she was, and so added to the other abuse was sexual abuse. She was raped on a regular basis. When she reported this to the nuns, of course, they blamed her, not the priest, and she was given an even worse punishment. She was now sent to what were called then the Magdalene Asylums, named after Mary Magdalene. Later, they would be called the Magdalene Laundries. By the 1940s, there were 10 of these prisons run by nuns in the small country of Ireland. Young girls and women who became pregnant, who were raped, or if a priest thought a woman was too beautiful and she might be attempting for men, or if by the other context she was thought to be plain and she might end up a prostitute, almost for any reason, girls, especially working class, poor girls, were sent to these slave labor camps where they were denied any access to the outside world and had absolutely no rights, not even the right to talk to fellow prisoners, not even communication. When they died, and usually they died at an early age, few ever escaped, they were thrown into mass graves, similar to what the Nazis did to the Jews. Ella was luckier than most because by the time she was about 16, she was rescued by her brother. He hadn't forgotten her. He found out where she was, and he ingratiated himself to a Catholic priest to get him to write a letter, because that was the only way you could get out of that prison. You had to have a male relative who knew a priest who would write a letter. And that's how Ella escaped, and eventually she and her brother made it to the United States. The tragedy is that for over 100 years after she escaped, girls were still put in these prisons. In fact, it wasn't until 1996, at pressure throughout Europe, that these institutions closed their doors. And then one prison outside of London, they were very, outside of Dublin, they were very profitable. And when the nuns sold their property, this prison, which had been a prison, where they did all the laundry. You have to understand, these girls made great profits for the nuns because they did all the laundry of all the institutions in Ireland. So whether they were hospitals or prisons or whatever, they did all the laundry. Hotels. And of course, they were paid nothing. Well, anyway, they sold their property, and some developers were building condominiums, and when they dug down the ground, they discovered all these mass graves where women had just been dumped in, young women. I tell Ella's story because it illustrates my theme, the impossibility of human rights for women wherever a state is controlled by religion, either directly or indirectly. Specifically, I will argue that feminism and monotheistic religions are incompatible and ultimately lead to the kind of abuse that little Ella experienced because religion had too much influence over government. I need to begin by defining some terms: feminism, theocracy, and monotheistic religion. Feminism Feminism is simply the belief that women should have human rights. This is the definition that the United Nations uses. And that these rights should be extended to girls, women, and homosexual men and women as well. I include homosexuals because invariably those religions that attack women and deny them rights do the same thing to homosexuals, and feminists support equal rights for everyone. In fact, the earliest feminists in this country put aside their own needs for freedom in order to free the slaves. When we talk about human rights, we need to include reproductive rights. I agree with Margaret Sanger that without reproductive rights, there is no freedom for women. Also, when we talk about feminism and human rights for women, we have to go beyond the public sphere to the private sphere, because most abuse of women takes place either in churches, as with Ella, private, or in families. So if you don't go into the private sphere, there's no protection, no denial of human rights. And usually patriarchal religions want to keep private separate so that they can abuse women in that. Just to emphasize the importance of human rights being extended to the private realm, all we have to do is look at sexual abuse of children by priests and, of course, Protestant ministers as well. But there's been so much in the paper about this. And almost always when these children would go to their parents would condemn them instead of the priests, because, of course, they were so enmeshed with the religion, they couldn't see what was happening to the children. And I could cite many cases of this. Family I know, all 5 children, 2 girls, 3 sons, were all sexually abused in Wisconsin by priests. And the parents just denied it when the children told them what was happening, even when 2 committed suicide. So that's feminism and a definition. Then we look at monotheism. What is monotheistic religion? Well, of course, this is the notion of one God. But we talk about monotheistic religion, to think about it for a moment. We are talking about religion where there's one God. And this, of course, anyone who's read the Old Testament knows the emphasis on Yahweh and the idea that Jews were conquering these other people like the Canaanites who had multiple gods. That was the sin. Well, actually, what the Canaanites had was a religion with a goddess worship for 7,000 years, much longer than Judaism has existed. There was goddess worship in which women were better off. Okay, it was what they were fighting, the Jews, was the goddess idea, the idea of the goddess. So monotheistic religion really came into the Near East from the north with invaders who were very patriarchal. And that we see with Judaism imposing this male God. Now, when we look at Christianity, what is it? We have a male God. There's no question God is male. We have, as people believe today, a human-God combination, Jesus. And we have this figure of a Holy Ghost that's kind of maybe a neutered man, certainly not female. So there's no female. There is a passive woman, human woman, who is impregnated, a common theme in pagan mythology. But no female God. So this is what monotheistic religion essentially is, patriarchal religion. The final definition, theocracy, is simply any government that is either directly or indirectly influenced by religion. And the danger of this is the denial of human rights to women. And we saw this even after Ireland was independent and a democracy. poor women had no democracy. When a priest, your father, your uncle, a priest or a nun, can throw you in life in prison, and you have no access to an attorney, no contact with the outside world, then you don't have democracy. So that's a theocracy. Ireland was a theocracy. And many argue that the United States is becoming a theocracy. Now, I would argue that there is an inherent conflict between monotheistic religion and human rights for women. I'm going to concentrate more on the history because I think people know less about the history than the modern and in the paper. And what I did in Oxford, I did longer, so I have less time today. When we look at Christianity, and I'm focusing on Christianity, we could look at the Old Testament, and if you look at the women of the Old Testament, they either use their sex to get something, like Judith, who seduced a man and cut his head off. That's a role model for women. Or and also Queen Esther was another, or the passive woman who wasn't even given a name, but who's praised because she allowed her father to sacrifice her like a lamb to God, to kill her in praise God for his victory in war. The epitome of patriarchal society. In the New Testament, we have essentially two women who are held up for admiration. One, the Virgin Mary, who's always referred to as the Virgin, sex is the big thing, who was, unlike other women, as the story goes, was immaculately conceived so she wouldn't have the sins of normal women. And then, of course, she gave birth as a virgin. So she is someone that no woman can use as a role model. The second role model was, of course, Mary Magdalene, who most Christians believe even today was a prostitute. That's what the Magdalene laundries were named for her. But in fact, Mary Magdalene, the truth is, she was of the royal house of David. She was a descendant of King David. That'd be like saying Queen Elizabeth was a prostitute. Actually was a lie made by Pope Leo X. But most people believe it today, most Christians. Anyway, we are supposed to see her as a role model, this woman who was a sinful prostitute and spent her life repenting. So women have really basically two role models there. Not only did Christianity give women poor role models, but what church leaders taught was misogynistic. I don't think most people have any idea of the viciousness and the hatefulness of early Christians. Now, at this point, I'm going to distinguish because most people think there were early Christians, period. But there were, in fact, at least two sects of Christians who were diametrically opposed in what they believed. Only one survived, so that's what people hear today. Okay. Those who survived, those who were made into the Church of Rome by Constantine, were called the Orthodox. Now, I want to read you what some of these Orthodox theologians had to say about women. St. Clement of Alexandria, one of their very early ones, every woman should be overwhelmed with shame that she is a woman. Another theologian who was made a saint said, among all savage beasts, none is found so harmful as women. St. Thomas Aquinas, the great leader of the church, compared women to sewers. He said every castle needs a sewer, so society needs women. They're a necessary evil. I could go on and on. Tertullian set up women. They're the gateway to hell. So imagine these priests reading all this and being indoctrinated in all this. Now, what we do, we know very little about Jesus. We he was and what he taught. But we do know that there were two followers up until 380 years after his death, when the Gnostics that I just quoted were made the official religion of Rome. Up until that time, there were two sects of Christianity at least, basic sects. And the other sect was called the Gnostics. Now, they were killed off, their writings were destroyed, but luckily in the 1940s, their writings were discovered in the desert of Egypt, some of them buried. So we have some of their texts. And we know from the Gnostic Gospels, from other manuscripts that were discovered, and from the actual writings of their enemies, the Orthodox, we know something about them. And it's important that I contrast this. They were very different. What they had in common, what the one thing they had in common is they claimed to be followers of Jesus. The Orthodox, and they're the ones that became the Catholic Church and from whom Protestants descended. So almost everything we know about Christianity was Orthodox. Okay. The Orthodox believed that women were inferior, evil in fact, and that the church should be authoritarian. All knowledge came through bishops. They believed in an authoritarian structure for religion. You got truth through bishops, and women should have an inferior position and certainly could not be priests or bishops. And they had this view of this patriarchal God. Now, as I said, that's the religion that survived. We know that the Gnostics were very different. The Gnostics believed that Peter was the rock, and that Peter was the person who was the founder. In fact, the Gnostic writings specifically state that it was Mary Magdalene who was the major disciple. She was the major disciple. And let me read from the Gospel of Philip. This was one of the Gnostic Gospels that was discovered. The companion of the Savior, and companion in those days meant wife, interesting, of the Savior is Mary Magdalene, but Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth. The rest of his disciples were offended by this. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" She may have been his wife. That doesn't matter. But the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostic Christians believe that it was Mary Magdalene who was the founder of the church, who carried on the work after Jesus was dead, and that it was and this is probably why Pope Leo made her into a prostitute. Anyway, the Gnostics, of course, believed in the equality of men and women, and not only in the church, but in the public life. And they had women as ministers and priests. But they didn't believe that truth came through priests. They were much like the Transcendentalists, the American Transcendentalists, in that they believed that religious truth came from within, that God dwelled in individuals, not some outside force that you got from a church. It was much more egalitarian and democratic. On this idea of women as priests, there's lots of evidence for it. Years ago, I heard a nun give a brilliant sermon on women as the niggers of the church, and she was talking about the early church in which women were priests. A Jesuit shared with us at the conference in Oxford the fact that he had actually seen some recently discovered graves. The Vatican is built on a graveyard, because outside of Rome they buried the dead. And most of the graves were pagan, but there were some Christian. Well, recently there was a cave-in, and this Jesuit shared that he had seen two tombs with drawings and writing, that were tombs of women. The breasts, it was obvious they were women, and they were priests. They were shown doing their priestly duties. And so this Jesuit admitted that there was absolute proof that women had been priests in the early church. But these Gnostics lost ground because along comes 380, Constantine is emperor of Rome. Who is Constantine? He's a smart but vicious person. He murdered his fellow emperor. He murdered his son. He boiled his wife to death. This is the founder of Christianity. This was the one who chose he wanted one religion that would be the official religion of Rome. Up until that time, you had pagans, and he was a pagan himself. You had pagans, you had Buddhists, because that was one of the ancient religions. You had Jews, you had different Christians. But he chose the Orthodox sects of Christians, the totalitarian ones, to the patriarchal ones, the woman haters, to be his official church. And I would argue he did that because he had a motive. He was about conquering people. He was about enslaving people. That's what Rome was about in those days. And they had a lot of trouble in the past enslaving people. When they tried to, the Jews at Masada, when the Romans finally conquered them, the Jews chose to kill themselves and their children rather than be made. In Great Britain, when the Romans were conquering the Brits, a warrior, one queen, Roberta, and her daughters led their people to be about like Cuba trying to resist the United States. Worse, the United States and Europe combined. It was the greatest army in the world. But nevertheless, they did. In spite of being imprisoned, tortured, and raped, she and her daughters fought back and led their people and conquered several Roman cities before they were defeated. Constantine didn't want this kind of thing to happen. He wanted to control people. And so he picked a religion that suited his purposes. He not only would unite his empire with one religion, 14 people, but I would argue that we see the influence of Constantine and the religion he chose throughout history. One of the first things they did was to suppress other religions and to persecute women. And one of the greatest tragedies for science was the killing of Hypatia. Hypatia of Alexandria was one of the greatest scholars of the ancient world. She was a mathematician, she was an astronomer, a philosopher. She was also known for her wisdom and her virtue. It's hard to think of a better role model for women. And of course, Cyril, who was later made a saint, ordered monks, fanatic Christian monks, to torture and murder her. They would later, of course, destroy the great library of Alexandria because they didn't like science. And we move on and look to the Middle Ages. Most people have no idea how bad that period was. I was fortunate to spend a year translating medieval manuscripts. Well, I don't know if fortunate's the word for it, but gave me insights into religion. In the 1400s, after the Black Plague wiped out a third of Europe, approximately a third, it was, of course, blamed on the two regular victims. It was blamed on Jews and women. Jews and women were the favorite victims of the Christians. And so, as you know, two German clergymen wrote a book called The Hammer of Witches, which was about how to identify and torture women, and they claimed that witches were primarily women. And they were very effective. The church endorsed this. subsidized it, endorsed it, and there started a holocaust of women. Many of these women were Jewish, and it's important to recognize they were the most common victims, but Christian women were, of course, killed as well. And one scholar estimated at the Oxford Conference that in a 10-year period alone, 2 million women were burned at the stake. What I do know, in one day alone, 900 women were burned at the stake while their children were beaten by priests and forced to watch. 900. Can you imagine the work that would take? When their kinsmen, when their fathers, their husbands objected, quickly silenced, eternal damnation. Constantine was right. There was a way to control people. People will fight and give up their life, but eternal damnation, boy, he's got control over them. One bishop murdered 50 little girls in one day. This is the kind of thing that went on. I would argue that we see it, people can say this is ancient history. It isn't ancient history. I don't have time to go into everything that's happening today. Quote, Susan Jacoby in her book, Freethinkers, A History of American Secularism. She says that from, and I quote, 1848 Seneca Falls Convention to the current battle over abortion, no cause has better demonstrated the conflict between America's religious and secular values than the drive for women's rights. After the Civil War, America's first generation of feminists, women like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, realized that all the wrongs against women, including denial of education, denial of the vote, and almost no rights within marriage, that this was all rooted in religiously based traditions that led women to see themselves as inferior. And former President Jimmy Carter, who himself is a devout evangelical Christian, agrees with Jacoby. And in his book, Call to Action, Women, Religion, and Violence, he relates current violence against women, rapes on college campuses, widespread and, as you know, covered up by college administrators for the most part, common practice. Rapes in the military, 1/3 at least of military women have been raped. He relates all of this violence against women with Christian traditions and worldwide with religious traditions. To give you an idea of this influence, because my time is nearly up, I want to mention two things. In 2008 in California, when unemployment was rampant, when families were losing their homes, when there were tent cities, when food banks were empty and people were going hungry, the Catholic Church united, united with the Mormons, united with Protestants to do what? Not to help the poor, but to defeat Proposition 8. They spent millions of dollars in advertisements that promoted hatred of gays virtually. Sermons were given in churches all over California. One man heard the sermon, got enraged, and went out looking for a homosexual to beat up. He found a man he thought was homosexual, beat him into a coma. The public defender was a friend of mine. She's gay. She had to defend this man, and he told how he heard the church, how they were going to turn, these gays were going to turn other children into gays, and he had a son. He had never supported the son, didn't pay child support. He had beaten up the child's mother, but nevertheless, in church, he was encouraged to hate gays. It isn't only in the United States. I want to make you aware that maybe you read in the New York Times what they referred to as the unholy alliance. The Catholic Church, because it has specific status, Vatican being a state in the United Nations, the Catholic Church got together with Russia, Putin's government, with the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, with Iran, among others, to defeat two things in the United Nations. One, a statement, to get rid of a hateful statement that said something like this: it is wrong, morally wrong, to kill gays and lesbians simply because they're gay and lesbian. Alliance wanted that out. Obviously, you should be able to kill them. The other thing they were going after was Draft 57, which had to do with women's rights. The idea that women should have human rights, that such things as they should be forced into marriage. And this was another thing that they're trying to change. So it isn't ancient history, it's happening now. I want to end by mentioning two men, and I don't want to imply men and men of the cloth even have been feminists. So I want to mention two Jesuits that I know. I've had the privilege of knowing. The first man was a devout Jesuit who loved being a priest, loved the Jesuit order. It was all he ever wanted. 12 years. He was in Rome, and he faced the biggest moral dilemma of his life, because the Catholic Church had taken a bishop out of the United States who was a child abuser, rescued him before he was to be arrested. And not only did they do this, they promoted him to the rank of cardinal. And this man, this devout Jesuit, had to give up the priesthood for ethical. His name is Andrews, and he's a dean at a Catholic college now. Chair of ethics at the University of Portland. Now, at the same time that Andrews was wrestling with this dilemma, another Catholic Jesuit, after 35 years of service in Central America, working with the poor, even being imprisoned and persecuted, was stripped of his position as a priest. What was his sin? Worse than molesting children. His sin was that he spoke out in favor of women being priests. He said that women had the right to be priests. They were just as likely to be called to priesthood as men. And he believed that gays should be allowed to marry. And he believed that priests should marry. And for that act, he was stripped of priesthood. Jesus is, at least attributed to Jesus, is a statement that I think these examples warrant. By their fruits you shall know them. I want to end with finishing Ella's story. Ella kept silent about everything that happened to her for years, until she told her granddaughter her story. Her granddaughter, her friends were visiting at her Angeles. She had recently moved into a little house as a widow. And a priest came to the door, asking her for money and asking her why she didn't attend Mass. And she went into the bedroom and grabbed a bat that belonged to her son, who was a baseball player at the University of Minnesota in pro baseball. So she had played baseball, so she had these bats all over the place. She grabbed a bat, started swinging at the priest, and in fact running out the door, chasing him down the street like a mad woman. Well, granddaughter and the fiance watched horrified what was happening. They eventually caught the woman before she could do too much damage to the priest, who was much younger, brought her back to her house, and forced her into telling her why she did this. And finally, it all came out. Ella told my parents what had happened to her. told them the whole story. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Sex in a Cold Climate's a documentary that tells about this. And there are numerous girls that, and actually young men were treated badly too, but not quite. He's involved in the Unholy Alliance.